Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing a total political autopsy on one of the most legendary conflicts in human history, the Battle of Thermopylae. But we're not just going to talk about swords and shields. No, we're going to peel back all that Hollywood myth and get into the really messy, complex reality of ancient geopolitics that put those 300 Spartans there in the first place. So if you've seen the movies, you probably picture these muscle-bound heroes taking on an empire just for the glory of it, right? But let's look at the real geopolitical mystery here. King Xerxes and the Persian Empire are at the door with an invasion force capable of literal total annihilation. So why on earth didn't the entirety of Greece stand together? Why, when facing total doom, did the Greek city-states completely fail to unite, ultimately sending what was basically a skeleton crew to defend their homeland? It's a massive case of political gridlock, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Here is our agenda for this explainer. First, the myth of 300. Second, a fractured Greek alliance. Third, regional selfishness and rivalries. Fourth, religion over war. Fifth, the tactical choke point. And finally, a necessary sacrifice. Let's dive right into it.
Section 1. The Myth of 300. Unveiling Historical Reality. Okay, let's go ahead and bust some major pop culture myths right out of the gate. First of all, you can completely forget that image of a young, bare-chested king. The historical reality? King Leonidas was actually a senior commander, around 60 years old during the battle, and the Spartans definitely weren't marching into a fight showing off their abs. They were practical, hardcore professional soldiers. They relied heavily on solid bronze Corinthian helmets, heavy breastplates, greaves for their shins, and massive shields that covered them from shoulder to knee. But honestly, the absolute biggest myth is the idea that there were only 300 guys standing there. The fragile Hellenic League actually sent a combined force of around 6,000 to 7,000 fighters. Now yes, there were exactly 300 Spartan warriors along with some of their Helot servants, but they fought right alongside over 2,000 Arcadians, 1,000 Phocians, 700 Thespians, and a bunch of other local allies. Still, even with 6,000 or 7,000 troops, that is an incredibly tiny army when you're trying to defend an entire nation.
Moving to Section 2, a fractured Greek alliance, the imbalance of power. Let's look at how this turns into the ultimate David and Goliath scenario driven by total political paralysis.
To really wrap our heads around the scale of the threat, we have to look at the Persian Empire. Ancient historians love to exaggerate and say there were millions of troops, but modern estimates put King Xerxes' invasion force at a very realistic but still utterly terrifying 60,000 to 80,000 soldiers. And this wasn't just basic infantry. We're talking highly advanced archers with composite bows, massive cavalry units, and the king's own elite 10,000-man bodyguard known as the Immortals. And against that staggering 60,000 to 80,000, you have the tiny combined Greek force of just 6,000 to 7,000. I mean, it's just a completely disproportionate matchup. The Persians fully expected the Greeks to take one look at the sheer size of their army and just immediately surrender.
So what caused this massive numbers gap? Well, it really comes down to this core issue of organization. On the one side, you've got the Persian Empire. Even though it spanned multiple regions and cultures, it was a highly unified, well-oiled machine. You had regional leaders called satraps reporting directly to King Xerxes, hitting their quotas for ships and soldiers. The military was meticulously organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and so on. But then on the other side, you have the Greeks. They were a deeply fragmented collection of fiercely independent city-states. They had zero central leadership, and they were almost entirely driven by their own self-interests. Trying to form the Hellenic League was, frankly, an absolute political nightmare of endless disagreements.
Which brings us to Section 3, regional selfishness and rivalries. Or, not in my backyard. Why exactly were they so hopelessly divided when the threat was this severe?
Well, the first massive political failure was just plain geographical selfishness. Every single city-state wanted someone else to take the hit. They all essentially had this not-in-my-backyard policy. At first, they actually tried to stop the Persians way further north, near Mount Olympus. The region of Thessaly sent 10,000 warriors up there. But the second they saw the overwhelming size of Xerxes' forces, they realized they'd be surrounded and just surrendered immediately, without even fighting. Literally, no one wanted to commit their full armies if it meant their own lands were going to be the battlefield.
And compounding all that geographical selfishness were these incredibly deep-seated ideological rivalries. I mean, just look at the stark differences between the two heavyweights, Sparta and Athens. Sparta was intensely, aggressively militaristic. Their male citizens were thrown into the brutal Agoge training camp at age 7, given practically nothing and literally starved so they'd learn to steal food just to survive. Athens, on the other hand, prided itself on democracy. the arts, and cultural sensitivity. Because of their grueling lifestyle, the Spartans thought they were vastly superior and completely looked down on the Athenians as soft and lazy. And the Athenians? They just viewed the Spartans as overly brutal thugs. This mutual disdain created so much friction that creating a unified military command was basically impossible.
Let's head into Section 4, Religion over War, the divine roadblock. Because beyond all the politics and the petty rivalries, there was another massive cultural constraint.
We really have to talk about the Carneia. The Carneia was a major religious festival in ancient Sparta honoring the god Apollo. And during this period, Spartan laws strictly forbade the army from marching out on any military expeditions. Period. To them, angering the gods by breaking this rule was far, far worse than any foreign invasion. And Sparta wasn't even the only one. A lot of the allied city-states were busy celebrating their own religious festivals at this exact same time.
So here is the real key to the whole numbers mystery. Because of the Carneia festival, King Leonidas was politically and religiously forced to leave the main Spartan army behind. He absolutely wanted to take the full force, but the laws just wouldn't allow it. So he made a massive compromise. He marched out with only his 300 personal guards, basically just hoping to hold the line long enough for the festival to end so the rest of the Greek armies could legally join the fight.
Moving to Section 5, the tactical choke point, forcing the funnel. Because of all these political gridlocks, the Greeks had to rely on extreme geographical tactics.
They knew there was no way they could win a battle in an open field, so they had to essentially cheat the math. That's exactly why they chose Thermopylae. Known as the Hot Gates because of the local geothermal springs, it was literally the perfect choke point. We're talking about an extremely narrow pathway. On one side you have the sea, and on the other a towering 1,000-meter mountain. This completely nullified those massive Persian numbers and all that scary cavalry. Xerxes couldn't surround them at all. He was forced to funnel his troops directly into those heavy Greek shields. Plus, right in the middle of the pass was this old, ruined structure called the Phocian Wall, giving the Greeks a ready-made entrenched defensive position.
Now, when the Persians actually arrived, they set up camp and just waited for 4 days. Xerxes fully expected this tiny Greek force to run away in absolute terror, exactly like the others had. By the 4th day, he was done waiting. He sent an emissary demanding that the Greeks surrender their weapons and he'd spare their lives. King Leonidas' response? It literally echoes through history. Malin Labe, which translates to, come and get them. Just an absolutely incredible show of defiance from a leader who knew he was vastly, vastly outnumbered.
Finally, Section 6, a necessary sacrifice, the political fallout. Let's see how this whole political disaster ultimately culminated.
For the first 2 days of the battle, that choke point strategy worked flawlessly. Using their tightly packed phalanx formation with those heavy bronze shields overlapping, the Greeks completely held the Phocian Wall. The Persians took brutal casualties, and even Xerxes' elite immortals couldn't break the lines. But then, that underlying political weakness of the Greeks reared its ugly head again. A local Greek man named Ephialtes, basically just looking for a payout, betrayed the alliance. He told the Persians all about a secret shepherd's path over the mountains. By the morning of day 3, the Persians had used that path to completely outflank the Greeks, coming up right behind them. The trap was officially closed.
Once Leonidas realized they were entirely surrounded, he had to make a really grim tactical decision. To understand his next move, we have to talk about what a rear guard is. In military terms, a rear guard is a detachment positioned at the very back of a retreating main force. Their one and only job is to protect that retreating army by delaying the advancing enemy, and they often do it at the absolute cost of their own lives.
And that is exactly what happened here. That famous last stand we all know about, it wasn't just some suicidal bid for eternal glory. It was a grim, absolute tactical necessity born out of a total lack of united numbers. Knowing the position was entirely lost, Leonidas dismissed the vast majority of the Greek forces to save them from a pointless slaughter. He, his 300 Spartans, and crucially 700 Thespians and some Thebans decided to stay behind. They fought to the death as a rear guard just so the bulk of the Greek army could escape and fight another day.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a thought to chew on. We rightfully remember the incredible bravery of the men who fell at the Hot Gates. But when we look back at the whole political autopsy, the geographical selfishness, the petty city-state rivalries, those inflexible religious laws, you really have to ask, if the Greek city-states had just put all that aside and truly united their massive power from the very beginning, would that brutal sacrifice at Thermopylae have even been necessary at all? It's a pretty chilling reminder of the true cost of political disunity. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and keep questioning history.